I'll confess, I was a wee bit intimidated coming here, and it got worse when I walk in and there's somebody doing equations on the chalkboard, and I was like, oh boy, I am way out of my depth. There's various ways in which I'm probably going to use terms that I don't fully understand for metaphorical purposes to which they may or may not be perfectly suited. So one of the areas in which you can feel free to interrupt me is around bad use of those. You're never going to be able to get me to actually understand it, but it could at least get me to use it metaphorically in a somewhat more accurate way in which I may be using it. And the reason I would be doing any of that sort of thing is that you know, probably the biggest problem facing the world of publishing is that publishing is a technology and a process for disseminating knowledge that doesn't recognize that it is that. In some ways, it is kind of the apotheosis of technology, because it is a technology that has existed for so long and has sort of rubbed up against the world of human interaction for so long that it has been kind of sanded down like a kind of a perfect chair or like a mountain through erosion in such a way that you don't notice it's there anymore. I have seen again and again when people walk into a room that has bookshelves there and a screen there, that everybody walks in and look at the screen. And in a sense, that's a kind of a failure, because the screen, you see it, you notice it right away. It's kind of an intrusion. And the bookshelves, you just don't notice, because they are just part of the furniture of our lives. But if you talk to people in publishing, they don't recognize that that is in fact what they've got. They don't recognize that they live in the world of technology, use technology, and therefore view the various ways in which other types of technology are incrementally or more than incrementally changing their practices, and they react to it, you know, as if it is an intruder. They send the white blood cells. But like with an allergy, you're not supposed to be sending the white blood cells. It is good for you. But they react to it as if it's an intruder. And so, but conversely, as I kind of argued, it is a technology, and I believe it therefore has a lot to offer. The history of the development of books has a lot to offer us as we look at the ways in which culture and technology are intersecting right now, and may continue and will intersect for as long as we have a world in which they can intersect. And so I want to talk with a sort of a mixture of humility and arrogance around what books can do, and what book culture, book business, the history of those, the present of those, and the sort of what seems to be the emerging future of those can tell us. So I'll start sort of historically with what you could call publishing 1.0. So publishing 1.0 is more or less the invention of the printing press. I mean, you can go back before that, but we'll skip that for tonight, and we'll sort of start with the printing press. Now, the person I have up there illustrating publishing 1.0 is not in fact Gutenberg. Part of the reason for that, as I was joking about a little bit before we started, is that Gutenberg went bankrupt. And this guy is in fact the great Italian printer Aldus Manutius, and he didn't go bankrupt. He did very well for himself. In addition to sort of taking the commercialized version of what the Germans were doing, in addition to doing that, he also invented the semicolon, and he invented italics from Italy. And he invented what was called the quarto, which was basically the closest sort of approximation one could have to an early paperback, something small enough to carry around with you. So he was, in that sense, sort of more of an innovator than an inventor. He took what was already out there and rejiggered it in order to make it more useful. Several things, both the physical object, but also the means of printing on the physical object. Without punctuation, printing was of limited utility. As we talk with one another, you can kind of hear through my inflections, my various speech patterns, you get a sense of the rhythm of my sentence. You can understand the meaning, and when that oral quality is taken away, it can be quite difficult to understand what somebody is saying. And when there were very, very, very few books, when it was just monks and the extreme rich who were able to create and read, everybody else just heard people reading it out loud. And so one didn't need punctuation. But at the point when all of a sudden the ability to actually create a text, reproduce it, and consume it becomes possible, then other little innovations start becoming necessary, one of which was punctuation. The ability to be able to arrange the words in such a way that the human voice is not required so that you can make sense of the syntax. So effectively, publishing 1.0 goes on for several hundred years. If there were a publishing 1.5, it would probably be around the mid-19th century, when you basically are able to attach steam engines to printing technology, and so you have a rate of production that goes from 10 or 20 a day to 1,000 or 2,000 a day. So you have a kind of that's the only major order of magnitude shift that goes on in terms of the ability to produce and distribute. This also, and it's also not something I'm necessarily going to have time to do today, but I just want to earmark it because I know Deb is very engaged in the world of music, and I'm betting pretty much everybody here is familiar with 3D printing. There's all kinds of interesting things that begin in terms of the invention of copyright around this time. And they have a lot to do with that thing, this process that I just described. And depending on the time, we may get back to it or we may not, but I encourage you to sort of Google terms like invention of copyright and start reading up on that, because you really get to see what a kind of an artificial construct copyright is, and how copyright is something that was used for a very particular purpose, rather than something that is innate, rather than something that is, as the political philosophers say, part of natural law. As was pointed out in a recent court case between a library consortium called the Hathi Trust and the Authors Guild, it's not even a common law concept, not to mind a natural law concept. It's something of very recent vintage with a very specific purpose that had to do really with being able to produce a return on investment on printing presses in the UK in the early 18th century. Moving on from that though, we do get to publishing 2.0. What I think, and in some ways this may be I think the most important aspect of what I think I have to say, but and I'm coming to it very early in the talk, so maybe everything after this is going to be a bit of a letdown. But the thing that I realized over the course of maybe my last 5 years, I've been in publishing for about 12 years now, 12, 13 years. Before that, I was a theater director. Over the last 5 or 6 years, I began to realize something about what had gone on in publishing. A realization that wasn't through any particular level of insight. It was just that I was very lucky about my own personal journey in publishing and was able to see this. The publisher that I was sort of closely identified with for most of the last decade was an indie book publisher called Soft Skull Press. Soft Skull began its life in something that you guys might not even, I realize now, or be familiar with, but something called Kinko's. Okay, thank you. Good. I haven't aged out that badly. Okay, so I mean, the Kinko's brand now technically is defunct. FedEx has been eliminating it. But before FedEx bought Kinko's, Kinko's was this sort of standalone thing that has a sort of a particular spot in the history, I think, of recent history of culture and technology, which is particularly salient in the world of publishing, which is to say that the other reason I used Aldous wasn't just because of the fact that he was a more optimistic figure than Gutenberg, but because a software company was named after him. And that software company launched in July of 1985 with a product called Pagemaker. And Pagemaker was the first time that a person with a consumer desktop, desktop computer was capable of making a master. We'll use the term master to describe something that could be used to reproduce audio or video or print. But it was able to produce a PDF, which was used, converted to PostScript to use to drive very large printing machines. And this is the first time in human history that anyone in this room could have produced a master of equal quality to that a corporation could produce. And as I'll discuss, it was another 15 to 20 years before that happened in the music business. It actually happens in the print publishing world of books and magazines, in 1985. And so because of Kinko's, where you could rent a PowerMac 6100 that had Alice Pagemaker and later Adobe Photoshop bundled on it for $6 an hour, a person could do this for $20, $30, $40, $60, $100, depending on how good you were with Pagemaker. Through, there are other things, through laser printers and through higher quality Xerox machines. By 1993, a guy named Sander Hicks, at the age of 20, having written a novel, probably not a very good one, in his junior year creative writing class at the New School University's undergraduate college, Eugene Lang, sent it out to publishers. They all summarily rejected it, and he said, fuck it, I will do it myself. And since me and my girlfriend are working the graveyard shift at the Kinko's on 12th Street and University in Manhattan, right by New School University, and there are no managers during the graveyard shift, we are going to lay this out on the computers and print it all night long, 4 to an 8.5 by 11 sheet, chop, tape bind, and over the course of 3 weeks they had 400 little sort of tape-bound, 200-page, sort of 4-inch by 5-inch zines, which he started selling in coffee shops and in a few bookstores in Manhattan in 1993. And without going into the big, long, extended history of Soft Skull Press, by 15, 20 years later, that same entity was producing Pulitzer Prize finalists and books that were on the bestseller list in the Singapore Straits Times, or that were on the Today Show. So in other words, all the appurtenances of traditional corporate American publishing were available to this entity that begins at a Kinko's. But more importantly than that particular anecdote, it is when the master, the ability to play with the big guys in the world of media begins. And there were hundreds and thousands of Soft Skulls, whether they were focused more in the magazine world or in the book world. And not only were these independent entities able to arise out of it, but also the large corporations themselves, their cost of producing masters effectively also it drops for them too. So what you start to get, if I may go back now in history and sort of like try to sort of re-prefigure this, in 1950, 8,000 books were published in the United States. And over the course of 40 years, that increased, but significantly, but not necessarily that dramatically. And it probably had less to do with technology and more to do with social change. Publishing in 1950 looked much like Mad Men looks, a bunch of, with the exception that they were less well dressed. So basically, it's a bunch of white guys in tweed jackets, as opposed to white guys in black jackets and skinny black ties, who are basically publishing one another. And women and minorities worked in the mailroom, if at all. That this is what is periodically referred to by certain people in the publishing industry as the golden era of publishing. As with so many golden eras, the golden era for the person that gets to describe it as the golden era, and not for anybody else. But through the relative decline in racism and misogyny and relative improvements, especially in the access to third-level education, so that people would have the intellectual, not just the financial, but the intellectual capital to be able to produce 75,000-word narratives, 100,000-word histories, 50,000-word analyses. You have a tremendous growth in the capacity to imagine a book and get it to the point where a publisher could publish it, and also obviously to be consuming them as well. But then, as I've kind of hinted at from my little potted history of publishing technology, we have a second quadrupling. And that second quadrupling occurs in the 1990s. And it does continue to increase, but the rate at which it increases actually begins to diminish. So when one talks about the history of the explosion and the democratization of media, the tendency is to look, bless you, Doug, to look at the more relatively recent years, to look at YouTube, to look at Blogger, to look at the late 90s into the mid-late aughts and afterwards. But in fact, with books, it is prefigured and begins an entire decade earlier. And and we sort of start to see some of the transformations that occur when information, the ability to both create and consume, and to sort of have those things kind of blend together in a, there's a amazing artist, I'm having this temporary complete brain fart on her name, Peggy Nelson. I remember Peggy Nelson. I once saw her, she might have just tweeted this, reading and writing are not, I'm going to badly paraphrase it, reading and writing are not states of being, they are activities which anyone may perform at any time. Whereas the history of publishing is actually the history of, in some degree, writer and reader coming farther and farther apart at the opposite end of an elaborate supply chain, which I may get to later. But for right now, so we see, things start to, the production of books. This is out of the traditional publishing system. I should caveat that this 2010 number, if you include self-publishing, and more important, if you include all those companies that are basically scraping Wikipedia and producing a book on the fly that you can buy off of Amazon, that number is now up to about 3 million a year. And so in terms of the total number of books available, I think in 1990 you're talking about 900,000 books, individual titles available in the English language in the world, and this year 33 million. But the point at which the number of books that have kind of passed through certain types of procedures that have a relatively high labor cost, copy editing, high level of interior graphic design, exterior graphic design, and that sort of thing. This is the rate of growth. But if you compare that to the music business, you see it's basically the reverse. The thing that I haven't thrown up here is when the Kindle comes along. The Kindle comes along in 2007. So that's the first point at which a reader gets to benefit from digital technology, explicitly, in their reading experience. Everything that I've described before is about production. But in the music business, it's the exact opposite. The consumption format arrives in 1993 with the MP3. And then a device that makes it all cool and sexy to consume that thing comes along in 2001. But Pro Tools on an affordable computer doesn't arrive until 2005, 20 years after you could lay out a book in a Kinko's for $6 an hour. So the music business and the book business are basically reversed in terms of how technology improved people's capacities to produce versus their capacity to consume. And so in some ways, music is way ahead of publishing because people have been having digital listening experiences for a very long time. But in terms of the democratization of the ability to produce, it's relatively recent. This has all kinds of sort of business implications, I think, for publishing. That I'll just be super brief in saying that publishing right now is basically benefiting from a kind of a CD moment, where basically everybody is going out and buying Kindles and downloading a whole bunch of books to go on their Kindles, much in the same way as at least I went out and bought a bunch of CDs of stuff that I already had in cassette form. But that tapers off once you've kind of like done your kind of right now I'm going to be a dude who listens to his music on CD and throw a bunch of money at the stupid record labels. At a certain point, the record labels don't start to benefit from, cease to benefit from conversion, and they have to sort of persuade me from anew why I should start paying for new music. At the moment, the book business is basically benefiting from that conversion thing, and it's not going to last for very long. But that's a little aside. So what pretty much I have described then is a process whereby innovation that occurred in the world of publishing, going back to Gutenberg and Aldous and coming back up to the present past PDFs in 1985, and even the kind of social changes in the United States that make intellectual capital somewhat more broadly distributed, those are all supply side things. Almost no innovation occurred in publishing on the demand side. And this particular thing that I have up here is something that was said by a guy named Gavin Potter. And I read it in an article in Wired magazine about 4 years ago, written by a very smart mathematician and novelist named Jordan Ellenberg, who was writing about the Netflix prize. And Potter was one of the more idiosyncratic participants in the Netflix prize. I'm guessing from a couple of nods that you guys are somewhat familiar with the Netflix prize. It was a prize Netflix offered about 4 or 5 years ago to improve their prediction algorithms around recommendation by 10%. $1 million to the first person or a group of people that get to a 10% improvement in the ability of their algorithm to predict people's ratings. Anyway, one of the participants in that prize said the 20th century was about supply, the 21st century will be about sorting out demand. And that to some degree is universal across all media, and I think with the advent of 3D printing it will just be universal across everything. But book publishing was the first entity to confront that. So just as book publishing is the first entity to be able to mass reproduce something, with printing mass reproduce anything in the 14th, 15th century, and then the first people to be able to do so at the level of a media thing, mass reproduction of clothing and steel happens at the same time, but certainly you could produce books at scale faster than photographs and faster than audio in the 19th century. And even, as I pointed out, in the 20th century, the supply side of books happens faster than in any other medium. So they have had to deal with basically the explosion in the availability of stuff earlier than any other medium. And so how have they dealt with it? Well, Oprah was the first way of dealing with the problem that we were producing lots of books and who could read them. Or how the fuck are the companies that make all these things going to find enough people to read at least one or more of those products that they could figure out how to make money? And so Oprah was the savior of publishing. And certainly that's how publishing saw it. But one of the things that I would like to kind of suggest here is that, in fact, books helped Oprah, perhaps even more than Oprah helped books. And that is because Oprah herself was in a kind of a stodgy medium. She was in the daytime talk show broadcast television business, which was a one person speaks to many. She wasn't even that highly rated early on in her career. She was an average date. Donahue had higher ratings than she had. She was in a pretty competitive daytime talk show host business. And she had the audience's attention for an hour, and then her hour was up and somebody else came on, and everybody, then people then made dinner and watched the prime time and went to sleep and went to work the next day. But when Oprah introduces a book club, she's got more than just that 1 hour. The book club allows Oprah to go into people's bedrooms, into the work cafeteria, into people's lunches with their best friends, the book club becomes a place where people's most intimate conversations around love, hate, shame, guilt, mourning, family, is enacted, is discussed in relation to a book she has picked, designed to allow her audience to help discuss that. So now Oprah is in people's brains 24/7. In their most intimate locations, in their bathrooms and in their bedrooms. Way more intimate than television. Somebody else's voice whispering inside your ear for 10 to 15 hours. In some ways more intimate than sex, because, you know, with sex you can close your eyes. With books you got to keep your eyes open. So you're still in this sort of communion with somebody, and Oprah got to oversee that in a way far more intimate than broadcast television would ever allow her to do. And in a certain sense, she was able to parlay that literally into a 24-hour cable channel. And when that cable channel started to founder 6 months ago with very low ratings, the first thing that she does to try and save it is she relaunches her book club about 3 months ago. What that suggests, though, is that one of the modes for discovery, for culture discovery that went on in books, had to do with having narrative be a part of one's daily life and using books as the sort of the Trojan horse whereby you could enter into people's lives. The next sort of main area of discovery, this, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, is a movie that was very influential in my life, at least in terms of being intimidated as a high school. This is Heathers, and to my mind this was the definition of peer pressure. You know, we use the word like advisedly, because to a certain degree you could argue that any form of social world of word of mouth, or the social graph, is just a sort of a dramatic expansion of the high school world operated by Heather, sort of Mark Zuckerberg forming the kind of, you know, unity of those four young women. So, I mean, obviously the primary problem, you know, without taking cheap shots at Facebook, but the primary problem that they face is that they are, well, is that there have been 25 million likes, and actually more like 50 million likes since I started speaking. Much like sort of Weimar Germany, when the supply of something tends toward the infinite, its value tends towards zero. So what precisely is the value of the like when 50 million of them have been issued in the last hour, or last half hour? It is a debased currency. When you're looking for choices about what to do with your life, the ease, and there's a logic to it with any consumer internet thing, you want to make it as easy as possible to participate. The problem is the easier you make it to participate, the less value the mark of your participation has. You expect me to give over 15 hours of the inside of my head to a book that you just clicked like on. So there's a massive asymmetry between the commitment that is being expressed in the particular kind of fairly shallow social graph that exists at the moment, relative to the commitment that you're being asked to make in your life, whether it is a book or a music or movies or where you eat or what you wear. And then the third area of discovery is, you could call the consumption algorithm. It's the Amazon people who bought also bought. It's a powerful data set. But as with any data, and as a powerful prediction tool, but with any prediction tool, it's only as strong as its data set. And one of the certain limitations of the Amazon data set, it ignores all books ever read before 1997. It ignores any books that have ever been checked out of your library. It includes any books you've ever bought for somebody other than yourself. It also includes any books you bought for yourself that sucked. So it views you purely as a consuming animal. In the way that Heathers and Zuckerberg view you purely as a social animal. And so part of what I've been looking at, what Small Demons has been looking at, and what I think, if I have a goal here, it is to sort of say, here's some cool areas for you guys to explore in the years to come, and it's an area that is relatively untrodden. So I would love to invite any of you to sort of, who are interested, to kind of be exploring it as much, as you might like. And that is that the culture itself is and this is where I get onto the bit where I get intimidated. If I'm sort of saying that the process of understanding consumption patterns and the process of understanding social patterns is too shallow, is too limiting, what am I proposing instead? If it's too shallow or limiting for the 15-hour novelistic experience, what am I proposing instead? And what I'm proposing instead basically is that the novel is the data set, and that the novel is the processor itself. Not just what is not just the what is operated on, but what is also operating. And I'm going to show you a few examples of what I mean. The first of these, this is infiniteatlas.com. And it is a couple of people who have gotten together and mapped every location in the David Foster Wallace novel Infinite Jest. This is just the Boston bit. Picked A because it's kind of nice and dense, and B because, where are we? These are things mentioned or places where something occurs in the novel Infinite Jest. And here is something very different. These is obviously a photograph from the Arab Spring from Egypt. But those Guy Fawkes masks, where do they come from? We trace them back to Anonymous, the hacker collective. But where do they go back from that? They come from Alan Moore's V for Vendetta. It comes from a book. It comes from a graphic novel. And in turn, that is, if you go back before V for Vendetta, you go back to a sort of a half-assed rebellion in Britain in the mid-17th century. But this effectively is a rather intense version of what I just showed you before. It is the ability to take a detail from within a book and extrapolate from it extravagantly. And to do so in a truly transformative and revolutionary, at times literally, kind of way. The book publishing industry, I talked about it in terms of it being focused on a supply chain, a big sort of big elaborate process between the writer and the reader. And what they use to track that is something called the ISBN, the International Standard Book Number, the SKU of the book business. And so the book publishing industry basically sees V for Vendetta as a 13-digit number, tracking the passage of a book called V for Vendetta by Alan Moore through a system. Whereas what it really is a series, as you had hinted at, a vast series of metadata points. One of which is this mask. So if you were to start to kind of look at all the data that exists inside books and started to try to play through it, you would start with the book, and then you would look at the characters in the book, and then you would look at what the characters do, you know, doctor, horseman, killer, criminal, something else. You would then look at what they wear, and then you get to the V for Vendetta mask. And then you get to the history behind the V for Vendetta mask. And then you think about the fact that both the book and the mask are for sale on Amazon. And that when you buy the mask from Amazon, Time Warner Inc. gets a royalty. Which is a little perverse, but there you have it. So here is somebody engaging in an elaborate glossing, an annotation of The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde by Junot Diaz, where you've got a Dominican motion picture actress on page 12. You have a imaginary virus in Stephen King's The Stand on page 12. You've got a bit of Spanglish translated on page 13, and so on and so forth. Pure labor of love activity. And you have Nick Hornby's High Fidelity, every song mentioned in it. But of course the hassle with all of these is that they tend to be one-offs. And so what Small Demons is about is trying to figure out how to disclose all this data at scale. So there's High Fidelity. And here is all the books, thus far only 3, that mention High Fidelity itself, although each of them will have multiple quotes. So here's 4 different mentions of High Fidelity in the book, published this book. Then we have all the people mentioned in High Fidelity, you know, a whole bunch of especially musicians and various celebrities, locations. You know, when I am signed in admin mode, so you're going to see, forgive me as you see some of the stuff that you see when you're in admin mode, which you're missing images there, but various parks and streets, Camden Town, various venues. I think the Electric Ballroom is somewhere in here. Then all the songs, of which there are an enormous number in this particular book. And if you mouse over any of them, you get the quote that shows the context, which I mentioned. Movies, TV, books, booze, gadgets, Doc Martens, etc., all the way through all the taxonomy of things that we ourselves are capturing. And we've got the same for about 10,000 books so far. But to go back, and I should show you, if you click on any, if you click on any one of those, actually Doc Martens is always fun. You will see all the books that mention Doc Martens. So it goes sort of book, shoe, book, song, book, place, mentioned in 178 books, chick lit, crime, you know, middle-brow literary fiction, more crime, various and assorted.
The last one would be essays with a Globe and Mail columnist, Jen Wong.
I'm sorry?
The last one would be essays, Jen Wong.
Yes, that's right. A little Canadiana.
But like all the rest are fiction, and that's actually a non-fiction.
Yeah, we leaned toward fiction to start with because it was a particularly good showcase. We've been gradually adding history, biography, memoir, but we're going to keep it to narrative stuff because most book content that is strongly analytical or prescriptive is already kind of structured in a way that lends itself to its sort of internal metadata being very easily exposed.
Like indexes.
A highly granular table of contents, all that sort of stuff lends itself as publishers realize that the interior of their books is as important as the container. Certain kinds of nonfiction lend themselves to that form, and certain kinds lend themselves to being on the web so much better they're never going to be books in the future, they're just going to be apps. But in the world of highly narrative stuff, where there isn't an obvious internal structure that lends itself to being a kind of displayed in an indexical or a nested table of contents, then our particular method of approaching it seems sort of the more useful. So we're focusing on that area where we can be useful. And then the other thing we're doing that's new, we actually haven't put this on the site yet, but if what's interesting in the books is all the sort of sets of relationships that exist amongst and between them, then the next level of thing that seems useful to be able to do is to allow people not just to sort of group things like all the people inside a particular book, but to take people from different books and cluster them in a particular way. So this is just a bunch of made up stuff we made up for ourselves to basically make screenshots for us to do the development work. This is going to go live in about 3 weeks. But so, you know, a list of things that are overhyped. 6 books, 2 series, 8 people, 14 things, or particular fictional protagonists' favorite drinks. And these are sort of lists that any of our users are going to be able to make, characters with great hair, that sort of thing. So this is a kind of I show this to sort of suggest that there is probably, that there are these sort of secondary data sets that can be developed from the original core data set. If the core data set is the connections, the people, places, and things in all the books ever written, then a sort of a secondary data set that you can begin to generate that hopefully will be useful is ways in which individual people choose to group those. You know, from a standpoint of our company, which is a startup and trying to get attention, we call this Pinterest for books, and you can take that with the usual grain of salt that you take any of that sort of stuff. But from a more kind of, you know, I think meaningful standpoint right here, it's a kind of a spin-off data set that opens itself up to interesting possibilities. And basically, that's it. And we can chat. I wanted to leave with this particular quote because I got to do a sort of a fun panel at South by Southwest about 18 months ago. It was when I first met Deb in person, with a couple of people around ways in which we could look at some of the rules of culture and see, well, do they apply in the world of technology? Do they apply in the world of science? Things like architect saying less is more. And what are some of the ways in which that applies with certain kinds of parsimonious approach to looking for elegance within science, to look at how one uses multiple drafts of something and types of iteration in the creation of culture, and how iteration is now, you know, sort of a best practice in the world of coding. And to sort of basically trying to get at certain ways in which we all have something to learn from one another. And so the company Small Demons is actually, the name comes from a writer, an Argentinian writer named Borges, Jose Luis Borges, who was a short story writer, essayist, and blind librarian. And in some ways, if there is anywhere where the web was prefigured, it was in the short stories of Borges. Borges imagined texts that had proliferated so much that they described a world in greater detail than the world itself. A map maker and a culture of map making so obsessive that the map became bigger than the thing that was being mapped. And he said this, which is a vastly more economical way to say everything that I just said, which is that a book isn't just a story or a set of instructions or a set of arguments, and it's not just all the words that are in it either, regardless of how their arrangement. It is also everything that every individual reader brings to it, the relationship that it has with the reader, the influence it has on the reader subsequently, all the individual things that a reader brought to that particular text that weren't technically in that text, because when it's just words, it's really just a blueprint. It's a blueprint for sound and sight and touch and taste. It operates on your emotions in all kinds of ways, which can't really be predicted. So it effectively is a kind of an infinite set of experiences all out of one particular text, and you multiply that by all the stories told thus far, and you get a pretty remarkable data set. And to sort of be kind of like argumentative to one last point, I think where the juicy stuff lies is maybe less in seeking a kind of a genomic model for books, to look into a book and figure out how can I distill this into a set of data, but rather in a kind of an explosive way. How can we use ways of understanding large data sets and understand what we understand of the human being, to find ways to manipulate and visualize all the possible data that comes out of a book, as opposed to the tendency which we have seen maybe in kind of over-literal approaches to try to take sort of some stuff that's come out of the Music Genome Project, some stuff that's come out of the Netflix algorithms, to focus on, okay, well, how can I distill a book down to a grid, whether it's in how many dimensions, a grid of essences, but rather how can I explode it so that it becomes a kind of a manual for living, a manual for sort of a design for life, which I think is what technology can help us do, is to lead larger, richer, bigger, maybe not bigger, but larger and richer lives. And so, in a very small way, we'll have an API in 6 months, but I also know that our data is, always going to be smaller than Google's Ngram data. And in the world of digital humanities, there's going to be data sets out there again and again, more and more of them in the years to come. So there's a huge corpus of stuff that is kind of, slowly being put out there in the world, and it's being done by a very, very, very small number of people with very limited resources, whether from the academic side, like the digital humanities programs, or for startups like us. And it's really territory that people have not trodden on very much. So it's going to need a whole bunch of people to find beautiful and creative ways to play with it. And so I hope, one or more of you might in the years to come. So let's chat. I should also say, this is my, so yeah, I'm Richard at smalldemons.com, and those are Twitter _Nash. So, whenever I do anything like this, I always like to say that you've got me for life, to the extent that you want me. So, if ever you feel like emailing me, my inbox is your outbox. Hey, just far away.
Oh, yeah, so there are a lot of big companies today, I'm going to go with Pearson because that's who I work for, who basically have these sort of absurdly large pre-digital databases where everything Pearson has is, absurdly large, and they have a really big difficulty integrating that with the digital world. Do you have any ideas on how exactly that transition is going to happen, or anything that this has to do with that space? Because that is something that inherently limits the size of your corpus.
Yeah. I mean, the irony is that Pearson is the most fucking advanced of all of them. Pearson actually has a few APIs now.
I wrote one.
Oh my goodness, dude! Congratulations. Yeah, I mean, yeah. There is. I mean, we're working on this set that has to do, like I said, it's basically narratives. Novels, memoirs, history, biography, that sort of thing. Obviously in professional and scientific publishing, in journals, in textbook publishing like Pearson, but even Pearson's subsidiary, Pearson has a subsidiary that is Penguin, which is a producer of books for consumers, optional books as you might call them, or discretionary books. And yeah, they've got a vast amount of stuff, and they are only taking baby steps toward opening them up. I mean, I think it's going to be, it's going to be sort of, they're going to open it up by 1,000 cuts, sort of to take the death by 1,000 cuts metaphor. Part of it is going to come from a certain amount of internal activity. Smart people from varying generations saying we've got to try something a little. Some of it is going to come by startups from the outside, either ones that chip away directly at the company by sort of begging them for content and then getting to use it. Part of it by them working with other companies and then making the company that ignored them jealous. Some of it is going to come through fear as educational entities. I mean, the textbook, one of the interesting, I mean, I didn't really get into this, but publishing is not really an industry. I mean, the little jokey way I have of sort of saying this is that publishers have only two things in common. One is that there are a whole bunch of different industries: the medical reference industry, the educational industry, the entertainment industry, the food industry, the travel industry, all of which at varying points in their value chain or amongst their myriad service offerings printed and bound something. The other thing they all had in common is they went to the Frankfurt Book Fair. So the definition of a publisher is that company that goes to the Frankfurt Book Fair, who goes to the Frankfurt Book Fair publishers. It was a kind of a circular thing. And once we all realized that printing and binding something doesn't necessarily mean that you have that much in common, when we start finding other ways of doing technology, then all of our commonalities start to disappear. The textbook business is particularly apropos because the logic around having tools for asynchronous learning be books or book-like things is kind of disappearing. So these companies have to figure out, well, how do I maintain my relevance in a universe where all I am trying to do is provide a tool for asynchronous learning. But they have a huge amount, they've got two things really going for them. They've got a massive sales force and a whole bunch of faculty used to being sold by them. And they do have all this information. They do have a vast amount of experience. So to some degree, fear of having their lunch eaten by Blackboard, by some entity that never even conceived of itself as being in the publishing business, but does recognize that it is in the business of providing services to the educators and the educatees, puts enough fear into a company like Pearson that they act out of terror rather than opportunity. So I think it's a variety of those things, and as each one proceeds along and they see that they're not getting cooties, or that some of the old choke points that they had, their old barriers to entry, and I cheat and start bringing in copyright here. You know, in a certain sense, you know, copyright is a monopoly on the right to reproduce something, but if the mere monopoly to reproduce something isn't worth very much anymore, then what do you need copyright for exactly? So the trick then becomes, how do you create unhackable? If you want to make money on something, you have to create something that is unhackable, because anything that can be copied by somebody else will be copied by somebody else. And it is true that a lot of publishers do look at the world of education and think it is easier for me to create unhackable experiences here, because I can have like a situation where my textbook is now a website where people have to log in, and if they don't log in, then you know, they don't get the grade, because logging in on their own unique username and password is linked to, you know, exercise questions and that sort of thing. So effectively they're able to move themselves from being an entity that makes money by selling things to an entity that makes money by selling services, some kind of subscription service. But, you know, in a less cynical way, you know, I think Pearson's creating that API is really kind of a cool thing, and literally no one has done that in publishing yet, other than O'Reilly, that get to be the sort of like idiosyncratic visionaries because they make all their money doing conferences. A long answer to a short question, but you know, pretty much all these questions are deep questions. You know, it's hard to do really short answers.
I have a question that might be shorter. You mentioned that there are lots of companies that pull stuff out of Wikipedia and publish it, and I was curious what they're making, or like that I've run across those. Or...
Right. So their business model basically goes like this. I found out about it because I got a call from the book review editor at the Washington Post when I was still a regular publisher, but he knew I was kind of into this digital stuff. So he said, I've got a colleague of mine, a columnist, Gene Robinson of the Washington Post, won Pulitzer Prize for commentary the previous year. Could he, is it okay if he gave him my contact info? And I said, yes. The guy called me, and he was like, I'm an author of a book I knew nothing about. It's on sale at Amazon, I just bought it. Yeah, I thought I was going to be able to get it, and then discovered that somebody had stolen my columns and I could sue them and get some money. But what it is, it's my Wikipedia biography. So what this particular book consisted of was all the Wikipedia entries for everybody who had won a Pulitzer Prize the year before. And that book has only ever been printed once. It was printed once when this guy went on Amazon and thought somebody had ripped him off. So what these companies basically do is, on the fly, they basically sort of scrape Wikipedia, use that to create book pages on Amazon within a product that Amazon has called Create Space, that basically is print on demand. It only prints a copy of the book when somebody goes to buy it. And so basically what they do is they create an imaginary product using Wikipedia text on the site, and then they wait basically for, you know, black hat SEO stuff to dupe some idiot into going and buying the thing that they could otherwise get on Amazon, on Wikipedia anyway, and they buy it for, you know, $22, and then later on. Amazon's been slowly trying to figure out a way to strip those out. But yeah, about 1 million of those 3 million books that were published last year are actually this kind of stuff. It began when they started doing public domain stuff. You know, they started doing Jane Austen, that sort of thing, and then they realized, oh, you know, there's all these sort of like semi, you know, these sort of things with a certain type of Creative Commons license that, you know, like Wikipedia, they can go after and do that sort of stuff on. It's quite hilarious. It's quite hilarious. It was sort of perverse that they made money off the dude who was trying to get there. I'm trying to remember the names of the companies. But anyway, it's probably, you know, people will probably come onto it eventually.
How do you see paper books as continuing to be relevant, or if they'll continue to be relevant as more stuff is digitalized?
I mean, you know, they're going to have a certain, I mean, you know, 40 to 50% of the recorded music sold in the United States is still on CDs. So you're going to have a certain legacy business out of people's, you know, personal habits. But there is going to be a kind of the book equivalent of the vinyl fetish, you know, that there is still a market for vinyl based on, you know, some of it is sort of like, you know, bullshit hipster stuff, but other parts of it have to do with people looking for, I mean, if you look at a, you know, any Kickstarter project, you know, people have a range of ways in which you can participate. And to some degree that has less to do with what the product is and more to do with what is the intensity of my affection for this person who has a Kickstarter project. And then they just sort of come up with a bunch of different ways that seem mildly plausible about why one version is the $25 version, another one is the $100 version. Now, I mean, I think the book business, business is maybe not the right word, but the world of the physical book will probably be larger than just the vinyl business. One, because vinyl only has I mean, if you include wax, it has maybe a, what is it, an 80 to 100 year life in the world. Whereas the physical book, you know, if you go back prior to printing, you know, you're basically talking about as long as we've had a civilization, we've had things that we've written on. So there is a kind of, its talismanic power goes deeper than vinyl. And so I think its longevity will go deeper. I think what you'll start to see is people, though, being much more selective about ways in which they engage with books. And that, and I hope, and some combination of hope and expect, hope leading, expect kind of following tentatively behind, that there will be some way in which we will look at that from an ecological standpoint. That we will start saying to ourselves, should thousands of trees be chopped down for this particular text? And oftentimes the answer will be no. But we are willing to chop down trees for a chair, for picture frames, for a sideboard, for a certain kind of a bookshelf, even if the shelf doesn't contain books anymore. There are certain degrees to which we accept that a certain amount of our finite planetary resources are okay to be used for a particular end, provided that we treat it with the appropriate gravitas. So effectively, you know, when somebody moves house, I certainly see this in Brooklyn. People move and they do a yard sale, and a certain amount of stuff gets bought in that yard sale. What is often left after everything has been bought, and the stuff that they want actually are willing to carry with them to the other place has been carried, what is left is a bunch of shitty paperbacks in a cardboard box, moldering in the rain around September 4th or June 5th. And we shouldn't be chopping down trees for that stuff. But for the book that you're willing to carry to your new house or apartment or new place of living, if you're willing to carry it the way you're willing to move the chair, then it may very well be that its value to you in terms of its sort of accretion of emotion. There's somebody who Deb's going to be bringing to speak here in about 3 or 4
Yeah,
weeks.
just like under a month. Yeah.
A guy named James Bridle has a beautiful, beautiful way of saying what I just said much more briefly. A book is a souvenir of the experience of having read the book. And so one of the limitations of digital books is that they don't necessarily carry with them some of that material. The coffee stain on, you know, the certain kind of dog ear. And so there's going to be a certain value to the way in which we have learned over thousands of years how to allow a book to be a souvenir in the way that a t-shirt is a souvenir of having attended a concert. But it's going to be shrunken, but hopefully imbued with much more social and emotional value and care. That's my optimistic version of the answer.
So I mean, so I actually buy vinyl. And,
I thought you did, which is why I was...
well, the neat thing about it, of course, is because music is so weightless, right? That buying vinyl is having the souvenir of having had it. And the thing about buying vinyl these days is that if you buy a record, you get a download code for the MP3s, right? So,
Yeah.
and I've been basically sort of pounding my fist saying, like, I want this for hardcover books, right? That if I buy the hardcover book, I get the download on my Kindle, especially when it's like the new Neil Stephenson book, which is like this thick. When I like pre-order it, it shows up. I realize I'm not carrying it around and like download it on my Kindle anyway. And so just those sort of modalities of thinking about how they have different affordances and that you want access to the different affordances of the physical book and the digital book.
Well, I mean, also on that note, it's probably worth noting that one place where the analogy between vinyl and books really, really seriously breaks down is that it's really incredibly simple to convert vinyl to digital. You put it on a turntable, automatically it's in digital, that conversion is happening.
Not depends on your
Well,
turntable.
okay, fair enough. Fair enough.
It's still, that's why I care about the download codes, because I know I have a USB out.
But there's nothing that even approaches an equivalent of that for a book. You can scan it in, but then what you have is an image, and the actual conversion of all the millions of books we've already published to a usable
Stuff is still crap. Yeah. No, you're right. I mean, it is one of the ironies, and it is one of the reasons why I sort of talk about a book as actually, the apotheosis of technology. Is it is in some ways it is this sort of absolutely perfect solution, and part of its perfection is that it's gone down one particular track so far that it is hard to kind of back up and go sideways into another technology. You have these, there is better and better and cheaper tools for doing the scanning, but even after you've done the scanning, the OCR accuracy is quite limited.
So the other thing is that vinyl is actually, music is mastered for vinyl differently than it's mastered for digital. So you actually it's like the equivalent of OCR. It's like you don't want to rip your vinyl, you actually want the things that were mastered for digital.
Okay.
So,
I mean,
if you don't have choice, you don't have choice, but.
Yeah.
I mean, then there's the sort of other part, which is vinyl is great and CDs are great, but at the same time, you still need electricity for them, and so they can't exist in their own space the same way a book can.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Music is fundamentally
It's funny, there's one of the products that was announced at the Frankfurt Book Fair last week is a $10 e-ink device that is supposed to have a battery life of a year on
If you're wrong about that, then.
2 AA batteries. But it's still, there is still this way in which, I was watching the ads, they had these sort of crappy video ads on at their booth, and I was watching how they enacted some of the cool stuff. They basically had some it was really cheesy. They had some couple meet over the fact that one of them had this e-ink device, and they make eyes at one another, and then, 20 years is supposed to go by, 15 years is supposed to go by, and there's some kid up in the attic opening up some big trunk and blows the dust off it and takes out the e-ink reader and it turns on. That's their like shtick. But I mean, it's like that shtick is fundamentally a skeuomorphic shtick of there's the photo album,
Well, there's
so
my parents' box of books.
my parent box of books, yes, so there is a way in which, and James will be much more articulate about this than I am. There are ways in which, and Matthew Battles too is another, somebody Deb and I both knows, beautifully articulate around some of these weird little gaps in the way that we've kind of inadvertently just tried to replicate something. I think, there is a way in which the book has already we've already had movies, we've already had pictures, people are still painting in a world of cameras, so there's going to be a certain natural residue of books in the way that there is a natural residue of horses, and some of the in-between stuff will probably fall away as we start to do just more what now may seem strange and beautiful things with the technologies that we are creating around ways of telling stories and providing analysis for things that will be coming out of the world of visual artists and be coming out of people who don't classify themselves in a particular way. It's far more likely to come out of that world than to come out of the publishing industry.